Welcome. In this lesson, we're going to tie up a few loose ends related to array lists. Today, we've got three learning objectives that are somewhat non-related, and I could have put these into an earlier lesson, but chose to wait till now because I thought learning them now after you've had some experience with array lists would make them more clear. So first, we want to be able to explain the concept of an index out of bounds exception. Also, be able to declare a non-typed array list, and we'll learn what that is. And then also discuss the return values of the set and remove methods. Let's start with the index out of bounds exceptions. So we already know that ArrayList methods often use index values. And just like with an array, if we try to access the elements of an array list using an invalid index, Java doesn't like that and throws what's called an index out of bounds exception, which usually results in your program crashing. To make sure that this idea is crystal clear, let's take a look at an example. So on the right, I have an array list called list, and you can see that it contains 6 elements, and the index values of those elements are 0 through 5. Therefore, it is perfectly legal if I wanted to say add at index 3, the value 5, and we can see the results of that here. I'm accessing an index value that is within the range of the array list, and therefore there is no problem. Not only can we add or access indexes between 0 and 5, with add, we're actually even allowed to add one index past the end. So let's say that I wanted to add an index 6, which is beyond the bounds of the array list. I am allowed to do that. However, if I try to access any index for adding outside of that range that we just saw, I'm going to have a problem. In this case, I'm trying to add the element 5 at index 10. And we can see that index 10 is well outside of the range of the array list. So I'm allowed to add between 0 and 5. I can even add to the very end at index 6, but index 10 is way out of range. And so you can see at the bottom of the slide the error message that Java gives me. It actually would crash the program at this point and tell me that I have an index out of bounds exception. It even tells me in the error message that I tried to access index 10, but the size of the array list was only 6. Now we'll shift gears and talk about non-typed array lists. So typically when we make an array list, we give it a type of data. And the example at the top of the slide, you can see this, where I make an array list of integers called list and set it to a new array list of integers. But it turns out that I don't have to specify a type. And so on the bottom, you can see an example of this, where I simply say array list, list2 equals new array list, but I don't say anything about what type of data the array list will hold. The potential advantage to doing this is it actually allows our array list to hold different types of data simultaneously, which is something you cannot do with an array. If you say that your array is going to hold ints, it holds ints. If you say it's going to hold strings, it has to all be strings. But look what I did with my non-typed array list. You can see that I add a string, and then an integer, and the results are shown on the right. We have 2 different types of data in the array list. So that seems like a big upside, but it turns out there's also some disadvantages to doing that as well. Let's look at an example to see why a non-typed array list might be a disadvantage in some situations. So let's suppose that I wanted to access the first element of list 2, which is the word hello. And more specifically, I want to access just the first character of the word hello, the letter H. So what I would do is I would access list 2, and I would go ahead and get element 0, which is hello. And then I would attempt to take a substring, 0, 1, so just the first letter of hello. Now on paper, this should work. But because I didn't specify that my array list was going to hold strings, Java actually doesn't know that the object at element 0 is a string. And because of that, when I try to call substring, Java is going to throw a compiler error and not run my code because Java doesn't understand that I'm legally calling substring on a string because Java doesn't even know that there's a string there. It is possible to get this code to work, but we're going to have to put in a little bit more effort. So remember that Java doesn't know list2.getZero is a string. So what I've got here is a typecast. So I know it's a string, I know it's the word hello, and what I've done is I've typecasted it to a string to tell Java, yes, it's a string, and by doing that, Java then becomes happy with my substring and everything works. So I can make it work, but it's more effort. And because of that, typically, if you really don't need mixed types in your array list, it's much better to just declare it as a type, like integer or string or whatever, just the way we've always done it. Let's shift gears one last time and talk again about the set and remove methods. Now, we looked at these in a previous lesson, but one thing I didn't tell you is that they return values. And so we want to get a handle on what that means and how we can use it. And we'll start with the remove method. So it turns out that besides removing, the remove method also returns the value of what was removed. So here's an example where I do list2.add 0, and then I say list2.remove 2. Now there's a lot going on there, so let's start with the remove. So the remove method is indeed going to remove something from the array list. Specifically, we're going to remove it index 2, and we can see that that's a 5. So we are going to remove that 5. But in addition to removing it, it's also going to return that 5. And what are we going to do with that 5? Well, we're going to add it at index 0. So it's almost like we're moving it in a sense. We're removing it and then adding it to the beginning, and we can see the result of that here on the slide. In a similar way, besides setting the value of an element, the set method also returns the previous value of that element. And I've got an example here. Notice that I'm taking list2 and I'm adding list2.set. So let's start with the set and talk about what that does. So the set method does two things. Number one, it's going to set index 0 to 10. Right now, index 0 is a 5. Not only is it going to change it to a 10, it's also going to return the previous value, which, as we can see, is 5. What are we going to do with that 5? Well, we're going to add it to the array list, and we know that when we add to the list, it adds to the end, to the right side of it. So we're going to do two things. We're going to set the first element to a 10, and we're also going to take its old value and add it to the end. And we can see the results here on the slide. Those return values can be a little bit tricky. So let's do an understanding check before we wrap things up for this lesson. So I've got a line of code that has a couple of sets in it, and it manipulates this array list over here called list2. And what I'd like to know is what list2 holds after that code executes. So pause the video, try to figure it out, and when you're ready to go, start it back up again. Let's look at the answer. So we'll start with the inside set. And we know that this is going to go to index 2, which right now is the word Java, and it will change it to the word world. In addition to that, it's going to return the old value Java. And what are we going to do with Java? Well, that's where the other set comes into place. We're going to set index 0 to that. So the result is this. We've changed index 2 to world, and index 0 has been changed to its old value, Java. After watching the lesson, you should be able to explain the concept of an index out of bounds exception, declare a non-typed array list, and can now describe and use the return values of the set and remove methods.